Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this lecture demonstration on the 32 piano sonatas of Ludwig van Beethoven. I suppose no body of literature, piano literature, has received more attention than the Beethoven sonatas. They were all published during the composer's lifetime. Just his contemporaries paid a lot of attention to them. Czerny, who was a student of his, made 2 editions of his sonatas 20 years apart. Moscheles, who was also a student, made yet another edition of the sonatas. His contemporaries began writing about the sonatas, and then right on through the 19th century and through the 20th century, there have been many editions and many books about this body of music. So about 6 years ago, when the publisher, Alfred Music Publishing, the chief music editor, called me up and said, the editorial board would like for you to undertake a new edition of the Beethoven sonatas. My first reaction was, why on earth do we need a new edition of the Beethoven sonatas? I mean, look at what we have already. I didn't say no immediately. I said, all right, let me think about it. Let me see if I can fathom a reason to have yet another edition or have another look at the Beethoven sonatas. As I began to look at the materials, several things became apparent. First of all, there are quite a lot of discrepancies in early sources. Now, we have autographs for 13 of the sonatas, and we have first editions for all of the sonatas. We have multiple editions for the late sonatas and several others that were published all during Beethoven's lifetime. The Pathetique Sonata, of course, which was very popular during Beethoven's lifetime, was published no less than 17 times by 17 different publishers. You have to understand, of course, that copyright laws were not existent at the time and the distribution was very limited. So the fact is that 17 different publishers could publish to their small market of customers, and this was perfectly in order. So there are a lot of discrepancies that are very small details, and it occurred to me that all of the editions, all of the editors thus far, had made many decisions in these discrepancies that I felt should be left up to the performer, not the editor. Those 19th century editors, of course, given the 19th century aesthetic and philosophy of editing, felt that they should elaborate on what Beethoven didn't put in the score, and they should correct what they thought were mistakes. Yes, there were mistakes, but they did a lot of correcting. As we came into the 20th century, of course, we had more of the so-called urtext editions or critical editions where editors were actually trying to work from the original sources and get pretty much at what the composer wanted down on the page. But still, even they made a lot of very tiny decisions, which I still felt should be up to the performer. Now, I know that as a pianist, when I was working on a sonata, I would have 6 or 7 editions on the floor around where I was practicing, and when I would find something that was strange, I would begin to check, and I would find oftentimes that decisions had been made. The reason I feel that it needs to be made up, it needs to be the performer who makes these decisions, is that as performers, we try to build a personal relationship with the music, so that when one plays, the personal recreation that you are doing has the power of your own decisions and your own personality and the way you feel about the sonata. You know, I always say, if I say to my students at the University of Southern California, you know, if you're going out on a very special date, you care about how you look. You care about how your hair looks, and you care about what you wear. And you may try on several things, but you finally come to that decision, this is the way you want to represent yourself. Conversely, if you care, then a relationship is built with the sonatas, and it begins to become something that is your concept of the sonatas. So it's not quite so much the process as it is, not so quite so much the decisions that you make, because in some cases you don't know what is really right, but rather the process of getting into these details. As we look at various aspects of the sonatas, you'll find that the details seem absolutely minuscule. Cecile Gebhardt, who used to teach for many years at the Eastman School, reported that she once asked Joseph Levine whether or not a trill should start on the upper note or the lower note. And Mr. Levine's answer was, well, it depends on the weather. Meaning, if it's a musical performance, who cares? And to some extent, that is true. But the details the details mount up, and the idea of getting involved in this level of detail is what constitutes the process that I was talking about. As we begin to examine some of these details, there's a couple of things that we need to take into account. First of all is the instrument that Beethoven used. Beethoven, for most of the period up through the Opus 53, and that's more than half of the sonatas, Beethoven was using a Viennese type piano. Now, that was the same piano that Mozart used. It was a light action piano with a rather thin sounding board, probably pedals that were worked by the knee this way, and with a 5-octave range. Now, you can see, because all the way up until the Opus 53, with one tiny exception, Beethoven makes everything fit in that 5-octave range. Sometimes he has to rewrite passages in order to get them to fit. If he transposes something from an exposition to a recapitulation, he has to rewrite it either down, and sometimes he simply leaves a note out. If an octave run is going up and he runs out of notes, then you have single notes. So he had to adjust to that 5 octaves, and he had to adjust to the limitations of the Viennese piano. Now, late in life, he was sent the famous Broadwood piano from London. John Broadwood's son actually visited Beethoven and was so impressed with the meeting that he went back and said, we want to send a very special state-of-the-art piano over to Beethoven. It was state-of-the-art, and the fallboard was inscribed with the names of 5 famous musicians, including one of Beethoven's lifelong friends there. And it went through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the port of Trieste, and there was an announcement in the paper in Vienna that the government had waived the duty on this piano so that Beethoven could receive it without having to pay extra money, and then it had to go about 150 miles by ox cart into the Vienna where Beethoven was. Beethoven was enormously flattered by this, and he wrote a letter in French, interestingly enough, in French to Broadwood, saying how grateful he was for this piano. But you know, when it arrived, he was practically totally deaf. And so the popular culture has Beethoven and his Broadwood, and yes, he was grateful, but it could not have been a big working instrument for him. And he was composing the last few sonatas at this particular time. So Beethoven's Broadwood was something that is part of the legend, but was not actually part of his working process. Now, interestingly enough, that Broadwood has been lovingly restored, and the artist Andras Schiff has recorded some small Beethoven pieces on it, which is available on a CD. I enjoy, now this is the state of the art. This is at the end of Beethoven's life. The piano developed to this point, and I enjoy playing even that piano, that recording for my students at USC, because they're always shocked at how fragile the sound is, at how muffled the bass is, and yet that was state of the art. Beethoven worked with even less developed pianos all the way through. Now, contradicting that concept is that Beethoven was a visionary. He was thinking orchestrally oftentimes when he wrote for the piano. He, in letters to the strikers, who were the piano manufacturers, piano builders in Vienna that lent him pianos often, he would comment that it was a beautiful tone, but he wanted more. He wanted more. It was not adequate for him. So he would compliment and complain at the same time. So what was going on inside of him, and particularly as the deafness came on him, was more and more of a vision of the piano of the future. That's why it works so, most of everything works so well on our piano in terms of sonority. There are some things which don't work as well on our piano. Those of you who have studied the Pathetique Sonata know that those left-hand tremolos at the Allegro in the first movement are hard to control. It's hard to keep them down soft enough. That's not true of the forte piano. You know, you had leather hammers in that Viennese piano and a kind of much more focused tone, and indeed you can let your left hand go and it kind of sounds like a timpani. On our Steinway, on our pianos, of course, it gets big and booming, and we say, oh, it's going to overshadow the right hand. So there are things that are advantageous, but of course, for the most part, we have today's piano works very well with Beethoven. Now, I mention this because we have to filter, to some extent, we have to filter what Beethoven wrote for the piano through the limitations that he had. The other thing that we have to think about immediately is the fact that what Beethoven wrote has been passed through the 19th century, where aesthetics were quite different. 19th century aesthetics were coming on during Beethoven's time. He lived in a time of change, as we will see in many of the examples that we explore. He lived in a time of change, but as the 19th century came on, and as great Beethoven players, great Beethoven pianists, edited and played and passed on their concepts of the sonata from generation to generation, we formed a tradition, and oftentimes that tradition is quite different from the way Beethoven actually perceived the sonatas historically. So if you go back to the history, if you go back to the historical basis, and you'll find that a lot of the things which I will say this afternoon, you say, well, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound legato enough, or that doesn't sound right. And it doesn't sound right because of that very strong tradition. Now, we can't throw the tradition out altogether. We have to study the 18th century. We have to study what Beethoven undoubtedly heard in terms of his piano, and then we have to see it through the filter of the 19th century. I always say, if someone does an ornament which is in a way that probably doesn't square with what Beethoven would have done, you know, I'm not going to faint and ask for smelling salts. I mean, if the performance is beautiful. Similarly, if someone doesn't articulate the way the score says the articulation should be, you know, I'm not going to gasp and find that this performance is not musical. We have all of these things filtering in. So as we explore what Beethoven actually left us in various guises, and we're going to be taking up a number of things, as we explore, you may find that your ear is not accustomed to some of the things that I may say. All right, given all of that, let's start then with the sources themselves. I mentioned that there are 13 autographs of the sonatas, and there are first editions and early editions. There are many discrepancies in these. Some of the discrepancies, these discrepancies are in terms of structure, in one case at least, in terms of notes, and a lot of discrepancies in terms of articulation. You say, well, if you have an autograph of a sonata, something that's in Beethoven's writing, why wouldn't that be the final source? I mean, he wrote it down, and then if it comes out differently in the first edition, that was probably a mistake of the engraver. Well, engravers made mistakes. We have letters in which Beethoven complains to the publisher at one point, saying it's very unpleasant for a composer to see his works published in a manner in which he does not want them, filled with so many mistakes. So we know that was true. But we also know that the autographs we have, with perhaps one or two exceptions, the autographs we have are what were called Urschrifts. This means that these were the first writing down. Now, Beethoven's autographs are notoriously messy. I mean, he oftentimes wrote in the heat of composition, so that you find measures scrunched together at the end of lines, you find notes scrunched together, you find sometimes lines extended in notes. In one place you find a ring from a coffee cup or a teacup that was sitting on an autograph. Many times you find repeat signs when he has passages that are to be repeated and they're identical. So in this heat of inspiration, he was trying to capture what he was hearing inwardly. But, you know, like a relative whose handwriting is hard to read, you get used to it, and you can really figure out what it was he wrote, even though it looks pretty messy. And after having spent many hours with this, I am convinced that Beethoven wrote down with an incredible degree of accuracy what he heard inwardly. And many of the so-called errors or inconsistencies, there's another reason. If you think out of the box, out of the 19th century box, there's another reason for it. And we will get into some of those. All right, that was the Urschrift. When he got ready to send it off to the publisher, he copied it out. He copied what is called a Reinschrift, a clean copy, and that was sent to the publishers. Now, most of the Reinschrifts we don't have, because as soon as the publisher printed it, they destroyed it. So all we have are the Urschrifts. Now, here he is making the Reinschrift. If he found a mistake, and if he found a difference, or he changed his mind about something, he would put it in the Reinschrift. Do you think he would go back and correct it in the Urschrift? Probably not. Probably not, you see. So you can't always trust the autographs to be the final word, in other words, of what he said. Now, here's an interesting example. In the development section of the Opus 53, the famous Walsh Sonata, there's a famous passage in which the first edition is this. And so forth. In the autograph, we have this. Sorry. Hear the change? As opposed to, so that's a whole different change of harmony for that. So that's one example. In the famous Tempest Sonata, there's a recitative passage. Each story is a little different. There's a famous note in the recitative passage of the first movement. Now, actually, there were two first editions of this, which we'll get into maybe a little later. Both of them have. However, in a copy that appeared in a printed copy, an early printed copy that appeared in the Archduke Rudolph's library and is now in a museum in Vienna, in a printed copy, there's a change to that, and it's a handwritten change. And experts believe that the hand, even though it's just a note, experts believe it looks like it might have been Beethoven's handwriting, in which case the passage should be. between. Now, it's only a small note, you see, but I'm only giving you a few examples of many of these. In the Opus 57 at the end, there's a very, very interesting change that has yet another story. In the autograph of the Opus 57, which we have the left hand at the end in this passage. And you have the left hand going. But in the autograph, this is. Now everyone says, oh, well, he just made a mistake. He didn't draw enough ledger lines. On the other hand, there are those experts who say, no, what this is a recalling of the opening figure of the sonata with those intervals. So you see, there's yet another one. Which is quite interesting and quite famous. There were two editions of the Opus 106 that came out quite close together. In Beethoven's last years, he was hard up for money. Early on he had a lot of support from nobility in the city of Vienna, although he was a fairly strong character and not always agreeable. They recognized his talent and tenaciously supported him. The problem was that as the Napoleonic Wars came along and as Napoleon came closer to Vienna, which he eventually occupied, these people fled. Oftentimes they lost their fortunes. Count Walstein, for example, to whom that Opus 53 is dedicated, and the sonata bears his name, lost both his and his wife's fortune through trying to resist the Napoleonic onslaught. And as this happened, then the nobility that supported him found that they could no longer do that to the same extent. There was still some support, but it kind of dried up. The other thing was that Beethoven's brother passed away, and Beethoven felt that the sister-in-law was unfit to raise the child. And so his nephew, he battled court battles for almost 7 years to get custody of Karl, his nephew, which he finally won. I mean, he won, and then she got the nephew back, and then he finally won a second time, and then he had the schooling to pay for. So he had both the legal fees and the support of this nephew. Between these two, he was hard pressed for cash. So about the time the late sonatas were written, he was sending sonatas to Paris and to Berlin and publishing them in Vienna and to London. In the case of the Hammerklavier Sonata, there's a London version and a European version that are published within a few months of each other. Interestingly enough, just before the recapitulation in the first movement, we have this progression. And then the recapitulation starts. Scholars have been bothered by those A sharps because the A naturals would make it the dominant of B flat. And there is no authority for that except in a sketch. He made oftentimes sketches of, and this passage happens to exist in a sketch. And in the sketch, the A naturals are there. But in neither of the first editions are the A naturals there, so that we are stuck with the A sharps. Those who believe in the A sharps say, oh, well, this was a much more original kind of progression and is in keeping with Beethoven's originality. Anyone could go through the dominant. So they argue for that, despite the fact that many editors have simply inserted the naturals, assuming that they are a mistake. One of the most fascinating things is the story of the famous Pathetique Sonata. As you know, the Pathetique opens with a French overture type introduction. And so forth. At the end of that page, it's about a page long, there's that long chromatic run, and then we have the allegro di moto. At the end of the exposition, in this particular case, you have the repeat. Now, let me finish this, and then we'll talk a little bit about repeats. You have the repeat, and so as he's coming down, now there were 17 editions published during his lifetime, and 15 of them have the repeat bar signs at this point. But 2 of them do not. Then later on, it was picked up by a very prestigious complete Beethoven's works published by Breitkopf and Hertel a few years after Beethoven's death, and again the repeat sign was omitted. So this left open the possibility of going all the way back to the beginning of the introduction. You know, one could say, and there are arguments of both sides. Interestingly enough, I just was talking about this sonata to one of my classes at USC, and I try to use different artists. Many artists do not repeat, but I played an older recording by Rudolf Serkin, and he goes all the way back to the beginning. So there are significant artists who believe all the way back to the beginning. And their argument is, of course, that, well, this is part of the exposition, and it's proved by the fact that when you take the second ending, he goes back to the introduction material, as you probably know. So that the end of the exposition and the development are linked by that the material again, and then just before the final coda, a fragment comes back again. And then, of course, he goes. So you see, those who argue for it say, but it's all through. It appears twice more. So indeed, it's part of the whole process. Those who argue against it say, oh, come on now. Of the 17 editions that was published during Beethoven's lifetime, and undoubtedly he proofed a number of them, the repeat is at the allegro di moto. So there we have a major issue. Now I've given you 5 or 6 examples of the kind of discrepancies. If you multiply that many, many times over, in every sonata, there are at least 3 or 4 or 5 issues in almost every sonata that one needs to decide. Going back to my earlier theme, again, these are small details, and you say, well, it's not so much what you decide, it's the process of getting involved at this level. If you're performing this music, and if you want to build your own relationship with this music. And I keep emphasizing that because, of course, these details are incredibly small. We're now going to move into the area, of articulation. Now, when you understand articulation, we have to understand that one major thing, and we'll talk about Beethoven and the pedal a little later, but I have to start by my discussion with articulation by saying that the use of the pedal as an instrument of legato playing did not exist at this point. Remember, Beethoven wrote most of the first sonatas with pianos that had knee pedals, number one. Number two, the idea of using the kind of pedaling that we, of course, think of as basic pedaling, the kind of pedaling that we sometimes call legato pedaling or syncopated pedaling, exists, of course, when the next chord goes down, the foot goes up, and then re-pedals after. Syncopated because the foot actually goes down after the sound. And that, of course, creates a kind of wall-to-wall legato. And that is a 19th century invention. There was a lecture that was given, there's a monograph of a lecture that was in the Library of Congress that was given at the Vienna Conservatory about 1854. And the subject of the lecture is a new kind of pedaling. And the so-called syncopated pedaling is described in detail. Now, how long, that's the middle of the 19th century. How long before that artists were actually using that, we don't know. By now it had filtered down so that someone was lecturing to the academy, to the students at the Vienna Conservatory, teaching them how to do this new kind of pedaling. Now, we're also close enough to, even though Beethoven's piano sonatas were written for the forte piano, for the early piano, we're also close enough to the harpsichord so that articulation is still a very, very important factor. And it's a very, very important factor in Beethoven. Now, this leads to some interesting kinds of things. First of all, there's a discrepancy in articulation in the very first note of the sonatas. It's curious. Many of you will recognize the famous forte piano expert Malcolm Bilson, who has just put out a DVD, as a matter of fact, on how to play classical music. And the hook on the DVD is, how do you play the first note of the Beethoven 32 piano sonatas? And the reason he did that is because that's a hook, because the first note of this is without a staccato. An error, because if you go here, if you go there, you see, you've got the staccato on the bass. But you turn over to the development and you've got the E flat, again, without the staccato. Now, when he comes to the recapitulation, there's no upbeat. It's, you see, so there is no upbeat. So you say, well, maybe, in fact, maybe that is the theme. So this is, you see, of course here, you have to reconcile that. So you've got two with, in the left hand, it's staccato again. So you've got two with and two without. So what's the answer? Did the typesetter make the same mistake twice? And which mistake did he make? Did he add staccatos twice where they weren't supposed to be, or did he forget staccatos twice where they were supposed to be? And curiously enough, in the same. So that's one of the kinds of things that we find. Speaking of staccatos, sometimes, you know, in the Opus 2, number 2 sonata, now, these are staccato. There's no staccato there. All right. So at the end of this, there is no staccato. Now, you turn over to the development, the same thing. Now, notice staccato, no staccato. Now, I'm going to leave out all of it so you can hear what's going on. Staccato, no staccato, 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 no staccato. You see the pattern? No staccato. And so you see, at the end of each of those, he's got no staccato, meaning that the note is longer. You're arriving on that. So that's an overall arching pattern. You can turn to many editions, which the editor has assumed, oh, well, they were just careless in leaving the staccatos off. Maybe not. There's a pattern there, you see. You have to think a little bit outside of the box. One of the most famous and fascinating of these staccato problems comes in the famous Apassionata Senato. And here, I must say that I had to think a long time about this one. I learned that as I was doing this, that I say, well, you know, he just forgot it. We have an autograph of the Apassionata, and so I can, both the first edition and the autograph agree on this. You know, I say, well, he just forgot it. And then I say to myself, now just stop and think. Is there any reason, can you think of any reason why this is, that he didn't forget it? He meant it this way. Can you think? And in 90% of the time, I can think of a reason. Now, whether it's the right reason, you know, I haven't talked to Beethoven recently. Here's a wonderful example of that kind of thing. We know all the Apassionata. That note is staccato. That one is not. You say, oh, well, he forgot it. But interestingly enough, this one is also not. So if you think of this not as a repetition, not as repetition, but as a lead-in to what happens next, then it makes sense. You have the first trill that goes. You see, so the non-staccato is answered up here. So you see, it made sense. Now, as I say, I can't swear that's the right answer, but there is a way that it would make sense. And almost 90% of the time, as I would look at this, I would think, well, it's a different way of thinking about the music. There's an interesting, in the famous Walsh Sonata, there's also a very interesting passage right in the opening. This is an eighth note. Staccato, this is a quarter note. So if you are careful, the eighth note staccato would be shorter than the quarter note staccato. So he's orchestrating. So every time that echo comes, every time that's consistent. There's no inconsistency in that whatsoever. So you see how those things operate. Now, there's a very famous passage in terms of whether or not to play notes. This is not exactly a staccato, but in both the Opus 106 slow movement and in the Opus 110 slow movement, there's a curious kind of notation that Beethoven has. Beethoven ties together 16th notes and then 32nd notes. He writes 16th, 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 and in pairs. But the interesting thing is that you say, well, that's just a tied note, so it's 2 16ths equal an 8 note. But he writes a finger change, 4 to 3. Now, Beethoven didn't put fingering down often, but there's usually a reason that he does. So he puts a fingering down. Now, some people feel that he was, some people have suggested that maybe he was trying to imitate what we call Bebung on the clavichord. You know, when the tangent, the little middle tangent on the clavichord rubs against the string, you can wiggle the key a little bit and get a tiny little vibrato, which was highly prized by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and others of the day. Some feel he was trying to imitate Bebung, others say, oh no, that's silly. But no one understands why. First of all, he would write the 2 notes. Why not simply write, instead of tying 2 16ths, why not simply write an 8th? And then why put the 4/3 on it? You can get half a dozen recordings of the Opus 110 and compare them, and you'll find that great artists do them both ways. Sometimes the note is repeated, and that's a fairly long series of notes. It's not just one. And so forth. You see, it's a fairly long, thoughtful recitative. So the question is, and many people say, well, he meant that the second note should be much softer, da, but then why the tie? A mystery that even today's artists disagree on and have not totally solved. Interestingly, in terms of articulation, there's a kind of poster boy example which historians have talked a lot about, and it's in a very, very famous piece which you will recognize immediately. It's the second movement of the Pathetique Sonata. He breaks the phrase there. Now this appears 3 times and he phrases it the same way every time. He breaks the phrase. Now he doesn't break it, he carries it over the bar line. He breaks the phrase. He breaks the phrase. Carries it over the bar line. Now you see, that's totally at odds with the way it's phrased oftentimes in 19th century editions, and you find, because what we are used to hearing, end of phrase, upbeat, new phrase, Now there's the 19th century phrasing. Now I'm going to play it again as Beethoven marked the structure. And there's been all kinds of speculation as to why would he phrase it in such a kind of bizarre way. I mean, what's the answer to that? People say, well, you know, he was a good musician. He thought, well, anyone can phrase it the other way. I'm going to do something different. And that would be in keeping with Beethoven's temperament, because he oftentimes liked to go against the grain. But then you have to go back to something I said earlier in the lecture. You did not use the pedal as an instrument of legato. And if you put your feet flat on the floor and play legato, then here's what happens. Now I'm going to go up. I have to pick up my hand. I have to pick up my hand. Now we can carry this over, but I have to pick up my hand. I have to pick up my hand. I can carry that over. So if you do not use the pedal for legato, it's simply the places, simply the notes that he wanted played together in one hand position. It's as simple as that. And once that dawns on you, it solves a lot of problems as to why he did that. Because you can find many, many places where the phrasing seems short and choppy, but if you remember that he wasn't using the pedal, then he simply wanted those legato together. Then he indicates, I want the next group in the next hand position. And it works like a charm. Now, you say, well, you've solved the mystery, but what do you do with it? Well, that's up to you. You can do the long line, which is, of course, what we expected. Some of you are old enough to remember Karl Haas, the radio show of classical music, and he used this as a theme song, and whoever was playing that theme song certainly used the long 19th century line, and many editions use it. How do you reconcile that 18th century limitation with our, well, you can, as I said before, you make your own choices. My choice is I try to have my cake and eat it too. I do what Beethoven said because that's the way he heard it, but I use the pedal in such a way, hopefully, that it also minimizes the choppiness that he probably wouldn't have wanted. So I try to have my cake and eat it too. You see, you heard this, but all right. So that's now. There are other things, however. There are other. Oh, incidentally, as long as we're on this movement, if you, one of the ways we hear, and the tradition I talked about, the tradition is when this theme comes back at the end with the dia-ta figures. You see, and we are so used to hearing that with pedal. But if you don't use the pedal, then you have no choice but to hear the articulation. You see that articulation. Now, I've gotten so accustomed to this kind of aesthetic that when I don't hear the articulation, I miss something, because it seems to me the articulation provides a nice little variation at the end. That triplet was introduced in the second departure, and it is carried all the way through to the end of the movement. So I like to hear it, but that's my choice. But as I've said, as I've repeated so many times, you have to wrestle with this, you performers, and make your own choice, you see, and that's what you want to do. Not always. Sometimes it seems to be strange, and again, you have to think out of the box. In the last movement, for example, we have this phrase, and he breaks the phrase. Why not? The reason is what happens next, because that's not what he does. He's got da-dee-da, that's strong, da-da-da-da-ba-ba-ba-ba. So that's not the end of the phrase, you see. That's the beginning of something which is going to be balanced with that, you see. So he thinks oftentimes in terms of those kinds of balance. There's a place in the coda, in the closing section of the Opus 2 number 1, in which he goes. Now, why not? Well, he's got this marked as forzando. What he's doing is so he wants this, not the end of phrase, the A flat, not the end of a phrase, but the beginning. Sorry. You see, so that you have that relationship that is clear, rather than in which the relationship is much less, you see. As long as we're on the Opus 2 number 1, there's some very interesting things in that with regard to the phrasing and articulation, and we might just as well explore them now. Beethoven, of course, liked to, I said, go against the grain, but we also, in terms of composition, he knew what expectations were. And the expectations by this time, in terms of structure, were that in sonata form, if you have an exposition, first theme in the tonic, then the second theme is in the dominant, and if you have a first theme in the tonic minor, then the second theme is in the relative major. That was the expectation. Beethoven, almost from the beginning, likes to tease people, and in the Opus 2 number 1, his very first sonata, which was dedicated to his teacher Haydn, we have the second theme should be in E flat major, you see. I'm sorry, in A flat major, because it's in F minor, and the relative major then is A flat major. Notice what he does. He does not go. No, he flats the 6. He teases you with the minor of that. You see, and interestingly enough, he breaks the phrase so that sforzando really jabs, you see, and that's what he wanted to do. Now he has 3-note phrases. He has a 3-note phrase, and that's a strong beat. So you see with those da-dee-da-bam, da-dee-da-dam. Now you'll find. Now what I'm going to do, just by way of an experiment here, I'm going to play you both versions. I'm going to play a 19th century version of the exposition of the sonata, and then I will play the 18th century using exactly the articulation that he wrote. Let me put one thing to rest. Dee da da dee da. That's the end of a bar. Dee da dee. Some people have said, "Oh, well, it was just a convention of the day to end phrases at the end of the bar line." Nonsense. You don't have to go very far before you find phrases carried over the bar line. So it was not a convention of typesetters to end phrases at the bar line. Okay. So as a matter of fact, the preceding phrase of that goes over the bar line. All right. So let's do the 19th century version first. Now I'll use Beethoven's articulation. Did you hear the difference? No. No. Well, it's subtle. It's subtle. But there's a small, many people have said yes, some people no, but the subtle, but there is a kind of rhetoric, a kind of vitality that using the 18th century articulation has. Oftentimes when you have small articulations that seem strange, it's the quality of the second note. I like to compare this. That goes over to the next beat, and the final note of that figure is at the end of the phrase. You see, if you fast forward to the Opus 10 number 2, same triplet, but it's not. So that you have the 3 together. Here you have the 3 slurred over to the last one. Here you have the 3 together and then broken. So the way you handle that is by the quality of the last note. Not, you see. So there, the last time I slowed off, the other time the note was a downbeat, and that relationship then becomes apparent. All right, so much for articulation. Ornamentation is one of the great questions that we really don't have answers to. Ornamentation was changing during Beethoven's period. When Czerny went to Beethoven as a boy just after the turn of the 19th century to study, Beethoven told Czerny's father to go out and get a copy of Carl Philipp Emanuel's book, which was about 50 years old by then, the essay on the true art of keyboard playing. And Carl Philipp Emanuel's book is one which has many examples of ornamentation. All these ornamentation examples are from the old school. Trills start on the upper note, arpeggiation starts on the beat, grace notes are on the beat. This is the old style ornamentation. We know therefore that Beethoven wanted to teach Czerny out of this book, and so he was familiar with all of this old style ornamentation, the style that was prevalent from Johann Sebastian Bach all the way through Mozart. By the same token, Beethoven had a colleague in Vienna by the name of Johann Nepomuk Hummel. Hummel had studied with Mozart actually, and Hummel, like many colleagues, he was a composer, pianist like Beethoven, and Hummel, like many people of that day, wrote a big method. Now, Hummel's method comes out just about the same time as Beethoven's death, about 1827, published in London and Berlin, 1827, 1828, along in there. Hummel's method is very boring for the most part. It's finger exercises, which we don't like to do very well these days. But in the third volume, Hummel makes an interesting statement. He said, "We all know now that the trill starts on the main note, not the upper accessory." So this is the first documented evidence that the ornamentation was shifting. Not only did trills start on the main note, but grace notes were before the beat, possibly. Arpeggios were before the beat, possibly. And so this has left Beethoven in that no man's land between when the ornamentation was changing. Scholars have spent lots of ink and lots of time trying to find where Beethoven changed from the old to the new. And probably my theory is that, in fact, he didn't change from the old to the new. He used both all the time. And we have examples of that almost from the early sonatas. In that Opus 2 number 1, again, which is that very early sonata, you have a passage now old style would start on the upper, and that is so neat in that passage at tempo. You see, that's neat, very neat in that sonata. If you go fast forward to the third movement of that sonata, we find that using the old style, starting on the upper note, becomes extremely awkward, and very, very few people do it. The tradition is to play on the main note. That passage goes. You have to do more. Or use the new style, starting on the main note, and becomes quite comfortable. Just a few years later, he wrote at the height of the development section of the Pathetique Sonata, a passage which is climactic and in which the tradition and everyone agrees it's main note. You see? So that means that even in early Beethoven, you have both used. My theory, which a lot of others agree with, is he knew the old, and he used the old when it was convenient for him. But Beethoven was certainly not a personality who shied away from doing what he wanted to do musically. So when the main note was in order, why, then he simply used that too. So you have to decide. Even famous Beethoven players have not realized ornaments the same way. If you take 12 different editions, for example, you'll find 3 or 4 realizations of almost every ornament. And so you have to pick the one which you feel is musically valid when you study this. The next area that I would like to talk about, we've talked about ornamentation, and then I want to talk just a little bit about how Beethoven did use the pedal, because it's quite remarkable and poses some problems of its own. Beethoven used the pedal as an instrument of color. The first time the pedal appears is in the Opus 26 Sonata, where he uses it at the closing of the first and last movements, and he uses it also to enhance the sound in the middle of the funeral march. He has the imitation of the drum rolls, and he marks the pedal. So he uses that as color. Then in the very next opus number, the Opus 27, number 2, he creates a problem that people have solved in different ways. In the opening of the famous Moonlight Sonata, he writes not once, but he writes twice without dampers. He writes it up here and he writes it down there. Even Czerny, his student, said, oh, well, he really didn't mean that. He meant to use the pedal and change it with the harmony. But scholars don't think so, because there are many other examples in which Beethoven does mix harmonies in a very coloristic way, almost an impressionistic kind of way. You have to remember that the piano did not have the sonority that we have, you see. But in the famous Moonlight Sonata, undoubtedly, many people believe that he wanted to create some kind of atmosphere. This sonata is one of the great forays, early forays into Romanticism. We have a piece in which you have one sustained mood from beginning to end, you see. No contrast to first and second themes. There is a kind of second theme, but the whole sonata structure is kind of submerged between this wonderful mood that he wants to create for these 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. So if we take that then and we look at that carefully, we find people have solved that in different ways. I'm going to start at the... Now, Charles Rosen, in a recent book, simply recommends changing the pedal a beat late. So you see, by changing the late, you have the blur, and then it clears up. The English person, Howard Ferguson, the English composer and pianist, wants to put a new technical twist, technology twist on it. The middle pedal, of course, didn't exist at the time, but he says put some notes down, secure it with the middle pedal, and then play it normally. You have that kind of haze, you see. Other people have simply said, well, just use kind of half damping. You see, I'm not quite clean in my pedal changes, so I'm just using a little bit of pedal. So people who want to fool with that at all, some artists do not, have tried these various guises. That one is kind of solvable. The pedaling problem rears its head again in the famous Opus 31 number 2 sonata, the Tempest Sonata, where you have, and we referred to that recitative before, where you have the long pedal marks in the recapitulation and these recitatives. And then it comes again a second time. Most people try to do some kind of pedaling there because there is anecdotal evidence which goes through several parties, but that Beethoven said it should sound like it's played in a vault. So he wanted this kind of. Then finally, you absolutely cannot ignore. Some editors do, but you cannot ignore what he does in the final movement of the Walsh Sonata, where the pedals are quite long. and so forth, you see. Those are quite long pedals. It's interesting that there was a tradition of just ignoring this for a long time, and then I mentioned Rudolf Serkin before. Several decades ago, Mr. Serkin played, I remember reading the reviews, played in New York in Carnegie Hall, and played the Walsh Sonata, and used Beethoven's pedaling, and the critics went absolutely wild. They said, why hasn't anyone done this before? Here is Beethoven the visionary, and this pedaling has been ignored for, of course it has to be done. It has to be done very carefully, and the piano has to cooperate for it to have that kind of wonderful, almost impressionistic sound. We are uncomfortable, many people are uncomfortable hearing tonic and dominant mixed, you see, and that's what these mixes are oftentimes. But Beethoven was not uncomfortable with that at all. You can find it all over the place. It occurs in the very final chords of the second movement of the B-flat piano concerto. There are long passages in the last movement of the Emperor Concerto in the development section where he mixes tonic and dominant in runs that incorporate both. So this was an instrument of color for him primarily, and he was not above experimenting with that. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, do we have questions at this point? Yes?
What it comes down to is that the printed music is not always the holy writ, right? The performer has to...
Yes, well, we start, I mean, the way, you know, as performers, we always have that balance. You know, in the 19th century, if you go back 100 years to early recordings, performers felt they had the license to create the performance as a means of personal expression, and they oftentimes violated what we would consider appropriate style to do that. Then along in about 1940, 1950, you know, when I was the age of some of these people doing graduate work, the thing was follow the score, follow the score. Then at about 1960, Harold Schoenberg began complaining in the New York Times. He was the chief critic of the New York Times. All the young pianists sound alike. They follow the score, but they have no imagination. All I hear is the same piece over again, played by different pianists. About that time, Pablo Casals made a statement in a master class, which was repeated over and over again. It's not the notes, it's what's between the notes. So there you have the eternal conflict. Yes, you have to start with the composer's intentions. You have to start with, and I have certainly represented in this hour or so, I've certainly represented digging into history and everything that I could to find out how Beethoven heard this music, both in his head and in actuality. But of course, that's only the beginning. You have to do that, and then, as I've indicated, performers have to make their own decision. They have to factor in tradition. They have to factor in the modern piano. But most of all, they have to factor in that growing relationship with the music themselves. And that's what you're talking about. No, the score is not the end. The score is the beginning. But it's a good beginning, you know, and because on one hand, on one in the end of the spectrum, you have performances by older pianists that we would say are self-indulgent now. They simply do what they want to do, irrespective of the composer's wishes. On the other hand, you have people who follow the score so religiously that the performances are kind of academic and dull. You have to find the middle point, and the personal relationship I talked about at the beginning of the lecture is. This process is one through which you can develop that personal relationship. Yes, then you have to go on and say, I'm going to start the trill this way, I'm going to do the trill this way because I believe in it. But most of all, you have to ask yourself, why? Well, because I think this note, you know, and that's what musicians do. I like to tell, I mean, that's what sustains us. There are no hard and fast answers, but it's that element of creativity coupled with discovery. There was a wonderful, I like to tell a wonderful story about a very well-known teacher who was for many years at the Eastman School. Her name was Cecile Gebhardt. She was very famous and populated probably more college faculties in this country with her students than any other single teacher. Very modest woman. And Mrs. Gebhardt retired, and she was my teacher when I took the doctorate, and so I went back to visit her one day, and she was in an assisted living but had her own apartment and her own piano. And I thought, well, I will find probably a very subdued Mrs. Gebhardt, this vital teacher. And you know, I rang the doorbell of this apartment, and she answered it with a score in her hand. And she said, "Oh, Stewart, I'm so glad you're here. You know what I discovered in the Chopin Nocturne? This E over here comes back over here." You see, that's what the musician's life is all about. Other questions? Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear.
I'm wondering the degree of freedom that the performer has in interpreting music. For example, arpeggiated chords and adding movements, things like that. Where do you stand on that?
Well, to some extent, that's a similar question to the one I answered. The degree of freedom that we have is a personal thing. I mean, you know, there can be. Sometimes, let me put it this way, sometimes Mr. Horowitz did outrageous things, but I was so excited I didn't care. You see? So the degree of, certainly you have to bring your own creativity, you have to bring your own imagination. I mean, as performers, we do recreate the music, otherwise it's just something in a book on a page. And so you have to bring your own imagination, and you have to ask, Olga Samarov used to say for every dynamic marking, for everything, you have to ask yourself, why? Why is it there? Once you've answered why, then you can ask yourself, then you'll understand how much. This kind of exploration. And then you have to say, why? What's he trying to say emotionally? How does that relate to me emotionally? Those are all the questions that performers need to ask themselves. Oftentimes, students are, when you're young, you're so busy getting the fingers to work the way you want and getting to realize a score that we forget to ask ourselves, we get to explore our inner relationship to the music, and that's why I kind of put that at the beginning of the lecture. So the answer to your question, how much freedom? Well, as much as you can get away with and convince me that it's right.
I guess what I'm getting at is in Baroque music, there are certain conventions that apply, that we know apply,
yes.
Must apply.
That's right.
Adding ornaments and cadences. I mean, there are certain situations where certain types of ornaments are obligatory. And arpeggiation is certainly obligatory, in a large percentage of Baroque music, right?
Yeah.
So Beethoven, to what degree do you think that tradition carries forward? In the adding of ornaments, there's certainly a lot of history in add ornaments and where you could arpeggiate.
My answer would be, did anyone understand that question? In Baroque, the performer is expected to contribute substantially to the performance by adding ornamentation, certainly in the repeat of a dance suite. Performers were expected to add ornaments everywhere. They were expected oftentimes, it was perfectly fine if a performer wanted to insert a passage of improvisation into a work. That was perfectly fine. By the time we get to the 19th century, the philosophy of the individual composer being a unique individual, the likes of which the world had never seen before and will never see again, had risen to the point that Beethoven was putting down pretty much what he wanted. And we have evidence of that because in one letter actually to a string player, thank goodness. He wrote angrily, ... does not mean ... slur. And then he elaborated that he was annoyed that his articulation had been changed. You see, so by that time, the entire relationship of the composer and the product had changed.
So would you hesitate, for example, to arpeggiate any of the large chords in the Pathetique Sonata?
Well, it's a matter of opinion. The Pathetique Sonata you mentioned, Thurston Dart, the famous British musicologist, suggests that this is a French overture. And indeed, the dotted rhythm of the French overture, all the way from the second Bach partita to many other, to the D major partita. And in the French overture, you're free to double dot and you're free to arpeggiate. So he would say, this is perfectly all right. Because that's all right that's all right in Bach. And he would say, well, it's a French overture style, and the French overture style carried right into the early 19th century, and this would be perfectly all right. I sometimes make that point to my students, but then I say, but don't play it at your next jury that way. So the answer is, again, is that there is no real answer. I mean, I think for the most part, you need to follow. I mean, obviously, this whole lecture has been about examining and following almost obsessively what Beethoven put down, because I'm convinced that he put down exactly what he heard, that connection was enormous. But by the same token, these other arguments could hold sway. It was still a period of transition, but we're moving toward composers putting down pretty much what they wanted.
And I have one more question. Have you performed on fortepiano, and do you advocate to your students, or do you suggest to your students that if they're going to concentrate on classical music and Beethoven,
well, I think yes, I have performed on fortepiano, but I'm basically in love with this piano. And I think the fortepiano has qualities that are remarkable. In Beethoven, I tend to side with Beethoven, the visionary. I mean, he wasn't satisfied with fortepiano, and I think that works well. I'm much happier playing Mozart and Haydn on forte pianos. But as far as students are concerned, it's I have to come down on the side of the modern contemporary instrument because it's a slippery slope. Our instrument didn't evolve to something pretty much what it is today until in the late 19th century. And there are those fortepiano enthusiasts who say that we shouldn't be playing anything up and before Brahms. We can start with Brahms and put on that. Well, in today's world, we pianists are not going to give up. I mean, you might criticize us for keeping Scarlatti, or Bach, but you really can't criticize. We're not going to give up Chopin. We're not going to give up Schumann. Because and practically, most of us don't have the money to have a fleet of period pianos in order to recreate exactly. So it's as I always say, it's like those. We see through a glass darkly. We do everything. It's kind of like those. It's kind of like those films, in which those spy films, in which we have a scene between foreign military officers, and they speak to each other, but they speak to each other in English, but with an accent. I mean, it's kind of a gesture toward the fact that they are foreign, and Well, actually, they'd be speaking in, Chinese or Russian or whatever. So we have to find that balance constantly, and that balance is different for different people, just as it is when you have great speakers or great storytellers. Some people can get away with saying a lot of things that other people can't. So, other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much.